for joining us to our August MicroConference. Today we have Roman Shaposhnik he has many roles, but in context of today, he's a member of the board and vice president with legal affairs at the Apache Software Foundation. My name is Patrick Masson. I'm the executive director of the Apereo Foundation, and I very much want to thank you for joining us. We hope you find these micro conferences informative. We try to touch on quite a few different topics, from technical to community-based to project management. So if you have any ideas or you're interested, please let us know. Jen Cummings, who you probably heard a bit from, can also be contacted with ideas or speakers that you're interested in. And please be sure to share this if you're enjoying these. If you find them helpful, please share them. So once again, Roman's going to be talking a bit about, well, not a bit, hopefully a lot about the phenomena of AI-generated code. And I just wanted to read actually the opening paragraph of the blog post that the ASF, Apache Software Foundation, and Roman put out when the generative AI guidelines or guidance was published. So here I'll quote here. Quote, "Unless you've been living under a rock for the past year or so, chances are that you've heard a lot about new generative AI is rapidly evolving and rapidly changing the software industry as we know it. And while it is fun to speculate about when exactly the tools like GitHub's Copilot will render all us programmers jobless, when it comes to open source software, there's a much more immediate concern at hand: intellectual property ramifications. While we don't really think about this too much, at the end of the day, every one of us is contributing to the open source software. Every one of us that is contributing to open source software is doing so by either exercising our personal right to license out the fruits of our own labor, or by donating something that we didn't create ourselves but have the right to share. In fact, any committer contributing to any of the Apache Software Foundation's 300 plus active projects, and I would say, interjecting here, the Apereo Foundation's projects, is doing so only after explicitly signing contributor license agreement that says, and I'll note that when Apereo started, I think we used Apaches as a model. So I would suspect that our license agreement is similar. But it quotes, the license says, "You represent that each of your contributions is your original creation." And leaving it there, I think this raises questions for developers and how they can use generative AI. I think it raises questions for projects, how it managed it, identifies that. It also raises questions for the foundation. And so I think this is quite a timely, maybe even a little behind as a topic that we should have been aware of. So I thank Roman very much for being here. I also real quickly want to thank JMA Consulting, who is our sponsor for Civi CRM, which is what we use to spam you all about updates. Big Blue Button, of course, is the platform. And most of all, I want to thank the community here for participating and joining us each month and making this a really lively and interactive activity. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Roman. Roman, let me set you up here as presenter. And you should be good to go with the presentation. I'm also going to turn off just one last logistic. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I'll follow up at the end of the presentation so that we don't interrupt Roman as he's going. There you go. Thanks so much, Roman.
Well, thank you so much for such a nice introduction. Just a quick correction. I used to be on the board of Apache Software Foundation. I decided not to be this year, so I'm ex-board, but everything else was absolutely nicely summed up. So as you mentioned, I actually play multiple roles. I wear multiple hats as it goes. And interestingly enough, it's funny I should be speaking about AI-generated code because my day job is actually a co-founder and CTO of a AI chip accelerator company. So we're kind of like NVIDIA, but much cheaper, much more energy efficient, and much more open. And obviously, a lot of things that Gen AI does, is only possible because of the hardware that NVIDIA, us, and other companies are developing. But that kind of makes me aware of a lot of things that is actually going on in the AI space, aside from me being vice president of legal affairs at the Apache Software Foundation. So let's actually get one quick thing out of the way, and I think I need to make sure that my slides have loaded properly. Okay, awesome. So that's great. Basically, what I wanted to say is that this whole project of us at the Apache Software Foundation was done not just by ourselves, but with a lot of help of other foundations. So there's actually an amazing OSI level sort of foundations mailing list. Some of the work was happening there, but a lot of block and tackling, a lot of the sort of figuring out the details was actually done by a wonderful legal expert at the Linux Foundation, Joanna Lee, who's a good friend of mine, and she's absolutely amazing at figuring out all sorts of threats and how to mitigate them in the open source. And a lot of the information that I will be presented was developed sort of in joint collaboration with Joanna and Linux Foundation in general. And if you read our blog post at the Apache Software Foundation, we also acknowledge that the guidance that Linux Foundation was giving at the time and Apache was sort of synchronized. Because I think it's super important for us folks at the open source foundations to be on the same page when these things come up. Because the worst we can do is speak with absolutely different voices, because that creates just a lot of confusion in the marketplace, and then people just get sort of absolutely no idea who to listen to. So luckily, in this particular case, the guidance that you will receive from the Linux Foundation, from us, from some of the other foundations is about the same. So with that now out of the way, let me just start with, and we were actually chatting right before the conference began about this. What was the problem at the time? And again, that's something that I highlighted in my blog post that we all felt we had immediately solved. The problem is that if you think about it, a lot of people contributing to the open source are actually doing it under a sort of a contract. And legally speaking, it's not even a sort of a contract, it actually is a real contract. And typically it takes form of either a contributor license agreement or a developer certificate of origin. That's what Linux Foundation uses in a lot of its projects. And there's language in those documents that applies to you as a developer immediately, right? That language basically says that, and just to highlight, the contribution was created in whole or in part by me, and I have the right to submit it under the open source license indicated in the file. There's similar language in the Apache contributor license agreement. Again, I highlighted number 5 and number 7 here. And at the end of the day, you kind of have to make those statements in full confidence of the fact that you can actually stand by them. So the first and immediate question that we all had to grapple with is, if you are using a lot of Gen AI, can you really stand behind those statements? Now, not only that, but at some point, the problem got wider in the sense that a lot of the employment agreements started having, generative AI clauses. And even then, on top of that, actually me being, a co-founder of a company was an interesting experience, because even the agreements that you receive during your funding, right? That is basically a typical agreement around, details of the company formation and, some of the intellectual property management and a lot of the kind of boring details. All of a sudden, those agreements started having, generative AI clauses. And I actually present to you one such example. That is actually something that, the company that I'm co-founder of had to sign, recently. And there was actually a lot of back and forth by my CEO and our legal team on how to massage this series of clauses into something much more reasonable. And interestingly enough, the guidance that we gave our legal team was to use the Apache Software Foundation generative AI set of guidelines to basically sort of comply with the things that they wanted us to comply with. So in a lot of ways, that guidance that Apache put out is now being used much further than just the open source development community, and it applies to even the business community. So the impact of it is pretty broad. Therefore, I think it behooves us to understand what we're really talking about here. But this document that I'm actually showing on screen is kind of indicative of what legal professionals are trying to basically look out for and kind of protect you against. So I actually highlighted a few things here. Hopefully you all had time to read it, at least, kind of skim through it. But there's basically, 3 clauses that are relevant to our discussion. So first clause is the company uses all generative AI tools in material compliance with applicable license terms, consent, agreement, and laws. Clause number 2, the company has not included and does not include any sensitive personal information, trade secrets, or material, confidential or proprietary information of the company or of any third person under the obligation or confidentiality by the company in any prompts or inputs into generative AI tools, except in cases where such generative AI tools do not use such information, prompts or services to train the machine learning algorithm or such tools or improve the services related to such tools. This is a very long and very legalese sentence, which we actually will try to parse on the next slide. And the final one, that's actually the clincher. That's, where a lot of back and forth happened. Clause number 3, the company has not used generative AI tools to develop any material company-controlled intellectual property that the company intends to maintain as proprietary in a manner that it believes would materially affect the company's ownership or rights therein. Now, again, if you kind of just, do the ChatGPT summarize type of an exercise on this blob of text, you will get the sense that, a lot of this is about intellectual property, as it should be, right? Because that's what in our industry, all of the legal teams and all of the legal professionals are concerned about. So let's actually try to parse it into less of a legalese and more into a human language. Arguably, clause number 1 just tells you Gen AI is not above the law. Because again, if you look at it, all it says is that thou shalt not violate license terms, consents, and agreements and laws, right? Like, as a reasonable executive, as a reasonable officer of the company, that sort of goes without saying. But nowadays, we kind of have to highlight the fact that within that goes without saying, generative AI tools are definitely very much included. So again, nothing new here. It's basically just, be a reasonable human being. If you signed an agreement, try to stand by it. So that's actually not even specific to Gen AI, just including Gen AI in a typical provision that would still be there with or without Gen AI. Now, the second one is actually interesting because on one hand, it's sort of still a whole bunch of nothing. It's just reinforcing some of the notions that we already had. Proprietary information still needs to be protected, right? With or without Gen AI. If you have a bit of a proprietary information, you have to be careful about it. I like to compare this clause to, how people used to treat the internet. Because believe it or not, I'm actually old enough to remember at least some of it. When internet came about, people kind of just didn't even know like how, private or public the documents put on the internet would be. So without even thinking twice, we had like super proprietary information, like, I don't know, QuickBooks type of information available on websites because people just figured out like, well, I have the storage FTP thing and I put all of my share files there. Therefore, it's just convenient to put some of the other files there, right? And like all of a sudden, a bunch of proprietary files ended up on the internet. So not again by any kind of malice, just by, not understanding what the internet is. So in that sense, the clause is basically saying, well, Gen AI is kind of like internet. If you put something into one of those tools, unless, and that's the number 3, unless, because the buck really does stop with vendors and their EULAs. So unless the EULA guarantees that it will forever be proprietary, even if you put it into that tool, you should assume that the Gen AI is just like the internet. Now, number 3, again, like I said, is very carefully done. And I have to give a lot of kudos to the American, to the United States legal system. because number 3 is exactly not like it is in Europe. Now, again, I'm absolutely not an expert in European law. I get invited, to a lot of these sort of European EU level legislative conferences as kind of an observer or maybe a consultant, if you will, sort of sharing my experience working with Apache Software Foundation, but I'm definitely not an expert. But my sense of, some of the things that they're grappling with on the other side of the pond is that a lot of times they basically say, no, the bug does not stop with vendors. So the bug actually stops with you. And that creates a lot of gray areas that are just like not nice at all. Because in the United States, at the end of the day, if you're reading through the EULA and the EULA guarantees certain set of things, then you can believe that the vendor will stand by them. And if you get sued over that set of things, you can actually pass the buck on to the vendor. So that's actually a very important provision. Now, as I said, number 4 is kind of interesting. The number 3 is kind of interesting. Because what it basically says is, and you could, try to read it again, but it basically says, thou shall not use Gen AI for generating your crown jewels. Well, what do I mean by crown jewels? Crown jewels is a piece of intellectual property that you're kind of betting your farm on. In a sense that if that piece of intellectual property gets poorly protected, then your business as a business might actually cease to exist. And because there is a lot of uncertainty in the legal landscape, which again, I will cover in the further slides, it is one of the biggest concerns to an investor. And again, we're looking at a document that actually came from an investor, trying to protect their rights in the company. But it's also would be the same level of concern, at the board of director level, at any given company. So one of the biggest concerns is that the intellectual property that gets created by the company is not adequately protected, and therefore the company as a business is under risk of that intellectual property being misappropriated. Now, interestingly enough, again, if you parse this sentence, to its full extent, there's actually this well, because again, at the end of it, it basically says that it believes, would materially affect the company's ownership or rights therein. Because again, at the end of the day, the buck still stops with executive or executive team of the company. And whether or not your crown jewels, as you see them, came from some Gen AI system or not, there still has to be a human being in the loop that looks at it and makes a judgment. And what that judgment is, we will cover, pretty quickly. Now, interestingly enough, a lot of it actually does not apply to open source. In a way, open source, as we all know, is protected by a very special license agreement, right? We call them permissive licenses. And they're permissive for a reason, because we do want that intellectual property to be spread far and wide. Now, we do put some guidelines, and again, some licenses are more permissive than the others. Obviously, there is the whole, GPL versus BSD type of a spectrum. But at the end of the day, we want that intellectual property to be used, right? Maybe within some guidelines. So the fact that, it would materially affect our right and ownership is not really that important to us. Or at least it is, important to a much less extent than it would be to a typical commercial entity. So even that alone kind of puts us, at a little bit of a relaxed position in the open source community, basically saying like, look, at the end of the day, even if the licensing that we put on the code base is somewhat affected by the Gen AI inputs, we're still sort of within what we're trying to do with that code base, if that makes sense. But I'll elaborate a little bit more. So what do we actually even mean when, we or I or anybody says code base, right? People typically get fixated on source code, but I actually like to start with standards and specifications, because a lot of things that we do, in the open source community ends up being open standards. And that is actually, again, a bunch of intellectual property that has a very special set of licensing, restrictions on it. Then obviously there's source code. There are images, graphics, artworks, documentation, tests, and marketing materials, right? Actually marketing materials, things like blogs, tutorials, what have you, are also bits and pieces of intellectual property. So if you look at the entire package of what we need to think about when we kind of grappled with these issues, it's a pretty big list, right? even though, again, obviously source code is probably the biggest one of all. So one option to basically look at that list and say, like, there's absolutely no Gen AI allowed in any of that, and we're good, we're set. And in fact, back in 2023, I would say it was a ton of knee-jerk reaction by big corporations, effectively saying like just Gen AI is disallowed. In fact, we will put clauses into employment agreements saying that, people are not even allowed to touch, Gen AI tools like GitHub Copilot. And then, of course, you ask the same either legal teams or, VP of engineering. It's like, hey, guys, so you put all of those constraints on your internal development team, but are you using open source? And they're like, of course. And they're like, well, but then you're by definition consuming Gen AI generated code, because I can guarantee you that not a single open source project today doesn't have at least bits and pieces of that Gen AI code in it. At least, major project, right? Obviously, there are projects that are sort of in dormant, almost like maintenance mode, and I don't think those sort of get as much Gen AI treatment. So this sort of, position of an ostrich, trying to hide your head in the sand is not really working out for anybody, because again, the whole entire supply chain of the software bits and pieces that gets into any product, be it commercial or open source, actually bottoms out at the open source, and the open source is already affected by Gen AI, whether we like it or not. So let's actually look into what can we do about it, because again, the idea that we can just ignore it does not work, be it in the open source or in the commercial setting. So let's start with a few basic facts. And, interestingly enough, when I actually recite those facts to people, a lot of times, I kind of, to my surprise, find people being surprised. So let's just go through the list and see if there's anybody in the audience who is actually surprised by any of this. So the first one should be completely uncontroversial. We all realize that the economic realities and property rights, as we know it, of our industry are really based on the notion of a copyright, right? That is the tool that we have at our disposal to basically manage, our property rights. Now, if you look at the copyrights, it's basically by and large, has been standardized throughout the world, right? The notion and kind of like the applicability of it. But there are still, bits and pieces of the interpretation that are very geo-specific. And like I said, I'm, much more focused on the United States. So at least in the United States, and here comes a surprising bit. Content generated by a non-human is absolutely not copyrightable. Now, again, may come as a surprise. It also may come as a surprise because, again, in the United States, the law is typically set by a precedent. So what kind of a precedent set that law is kind of funny, because there was a lawsuit over a set of photographs taken by a monkey. So a monkey in a zoo was given a camera, and monkeys are pretty smart, so it figured out how to use a camera and took a bunch of pictures. And all of a sudden, there was a question like, who actually those pictures belong to in the sense of a property, right? Do these pictures belong to the photographer who gave monkey the camera? Do those pictures belong to the monkey? Who do they belong to? And there was actually, a legal case brought up that settled it once and for all, that the copyrightable material can only be produced by a human, cannot be even produced by a monkey, not even by a very smart monkey. So it's kind of funny to think that a lot of the AI case law is now referring back to the case that was actually between monkeys and humans. So kind of funny like that. But it is absolutely true that, again, it is not copyrightable. And once you let that notion sink in, you kind of start getting a feeling like, well, if it's not copyrightable, then like if, let's say, AI has generated, the entirety of the code base, it's not even that we're violating anybody's rights. It's like we cannot really get the rights to ourselves. Like that thing is not copyrightable to begin with, right? So there's no way we can actually protect it. And again, to the open source community, less of a concern, but at least some of the concerns still, because again, we would love for the guidelines of our licenses to, still be enforceable, but it's way bigger concern for any commercial entity. So you kind of start to understand where the worry comes from. Now, the next item is also kind of interesting, because even though the AI content, because again, it was created by a non-human, even if it doesn't have any sort of bits and pieces embedded in it that are verbatim copying, something that is copyrightable. Now, that is completely not copyrightable. But at the meta level, a human being can work with that set of bits and basically compose it into something else that now becomes copyrightable. So again, a little bit, non-intuitive, because you start with something that is not copyrightable, but the creative act of working with that base makes the end result copyrightable. Again, a little bit of a kind of like wiggle room here, and I'm sure it will be used a lot in the coming years, when some of the cases I'm going to talk about will get settled. Now, finally, again, as we all know, and that typically doesn't come as a surprise to anybody, at least not anymore, is even though AI cannot author copyrightable material, but a human being driving AI can actually violate copyright. Meaning that if I prompt AI just so, I cannot then blame AI for producing, let's say, bits and pieces that are exactly copied from somebody else's code base. I cannot say, well, that's AI fault, right? No, it's my fault because I received the output, and by some way of verifying, I didn't verify that it now violates somebody else's copyright. And there's actually a few lawsuits brought against companies. So there's obviously Copilot litigation, which kind of sort of hinges on Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which I find funny as well. There's obviously Getty Images versus Stability that was publicized, quite a bit. I maintain this link. You can go to it. It's there's a URL shortener s.apache.org/GenAI case tracker. And you could basically see a lot of cases, and pretty much none of them have been settled. I don't think a single one of them has been settled yet. I'm pretty diligent at, tracking it. So we should really start looking at settled case law, I would say, in a year or two, right? Even though the oldest case in that bunch is probably 2 years old by now, those are really thorny legal litigations, and they take a lot of time to basically settle. But with that, a few of basic facts in mind, let's actually think about what are the pitfalls, right? What should we, like, now that we understand, what guides us, in making those decisions, let's actually come and, think through what scenarios we should cover, understanding, those data points to basically protect ourselves, or at least, try to protect ourselves. Because again, at this point, the case law has not been settled. So there's absolutely no such thing as, bulletproof policy. We all need to evolve pretty much day by day. So what are the pitfalls? Well, as I mentioned, you can basically run into an accidental copyright infringement. Again, you're using GenAI tool, it spits out something that is copyrightable, you put it into your code base, into your documentation or whatever, all of a sudden you're violating somebody else's copyright. Now, as I mentioned here on this slide as well, the problem is that that is not a new problem, right? In the open source community, we kind of trust the contributors that they will not just copy and paste. Although, again, if you think about even things like Stack Overflow, a lot of the bits and pieces from Stack Overflow end up in our code base. And actually, the Stack Overflow license, as it existed at least a few years ago, was completely incompatible. Well, I shouldn't say completely, but was somewhat incompatible with Apache license, and it was definitely incompatible with the GNU license. So even if you just copy and paste from Stack Overflow, which a lot of developers have been doing for years, you're already kind of looking into the same problem. Definitely license compliance becomes an issue, because what I mean by license compliance is even if the bit of code that the GenAI spewed at you is free to use, so like suppose you're passing the number one and the code is from somebody else's code base, but that code base is permissively licensed, so like it's okay for you to use that piece of code. So you're not really doing the infringement, but you still have to comply with the terms of the license. So again, it would be really nice if a GenAI tool told you like, well, look, this code sort of looks sort of familiar to the, to me. It may have come from this code base that is under the Apache license. Therefore, you need to copy the notice file, because again, that's one of the constraints that Apache license puts on you when you use, code license under the Apache license. But it doesn't happen, so you kind of have to watch out for that. Now, the number 3 is kind of tricky, because absolutely nobody ever reads EULAs, right? End user license agreements. are just these horrendous legal documents that go on for pages, and we just all have way better things to do than to read them. Now, a lot of them, especially associated with Gen AI tools like ChatGPT, for example, have restrictions on use of the output of the tool. And two of my kind of most, favorite restrictions in quotes, because I just like giving those examples to people who don't even realize that they're under such restriction. So one restriction is that by anything that you do with the output of ChatGPT, you can never use that output to train a competitor model. Now, again, all of a sudden, it's like, I could sort of see why OpenAI would put that clause there, but you don't expect it. And therefore, it's something that you kind of like, it just startles you, right? Well, speaking of being startled, there is yet another EULA clause that, again, I haven't checked, recently, but at least it was there half a year ago, that you cannot use the ChatGPT output for political campaign purposes. Now, again, that seems kind of random, but it's there. So you really have to watch out for these types of use restriction clauses in EULAs, because they're there, and they're there to kind of bite you. Now, again, as we covered before, compatibility with employment contracts or contracts in general, or even things like, DCOs and CLAs becomes a bigger issue. Now that we, again, provided some of the guidance, to our developers, so at least, we have sort of an answer to that. Finally, there are basically bits and pieces of how we construct our software. Incomplete and misleading software bills of materials, are a problem if you use Gen AI. And obviously, if you have trained your users on really trusting your SBOMs, now that trust may somewhat be eroded. Again, as I mentioned, open source in general doesn't have a police force, not even, wealthy foundations. So all of the things above, we kind of put on the shoulders of developers and contributors and just tell them, like, deal with it, right? So how can they deal with it? Or even how a CTO of a corporation or VP of engineering, can deal with these things? Like I said, I mean, there's a conservative approach, do not accept anything, doesn't work, everybody understood that. There's a sort of a use case by use case approach. Let's use generative AI for some context, let's say debugging, or maybe test creation, something that doesn't really infect the code base as much. We really feel that this actually puts a lot of undue burden on at least open source developers. And again, commercial developers told us exactly the same. So it's not really a good compromise anyway. There's actually a way that is being popularized in the sort of traditional software development community that has nothing to do with open source, and that is deciding based on the tool features and EULAs. So again, just use the AI tools, let's say, trains on permissively licensed content, and trust the EULA and trust the promise of the vendor that it will not really infect your code base with anything else. Possible, and actually may be one of the things that you would consider. I definitely don't think it's possible for the open source, because those types of tools are, first of all, too restrictive, and those types of features tend to be paid features. And again, open source developers don't really like to pay money to vendors, right? So we cannot really rely on that. Now, number 4 is sort of like blind trust to the developer, kind of what it is today in a lot of places. We prefer trust the developer, but with guidance. So what is the guidance? Well, ASF's view, and again, you can go to this URL and just read it in full entirety. But ASF's view is, it kind of boils down to 2 things, right? So first of all, make sure that the generative AI tool does not place any restrictions on the output, and it can be consistent with the open source definition. So again, if you're using ChatGPT, I'm sorry to say that, but that is incompatible. The output of that is incompatible by explicit statements from OpenAI with the open source definition, and you're kind of out of luck. If you use things like Claude Code, for example, it doesn't really have those types of restrictions, at least not to the extent that ChatGPT has. So that's fine. Actually, Claude, that is kind of like Claude ChatGPT-like thing, does have similar restrictions. So it's weird. Claude Code doesn't, but this does. So it's weird. But you really have to read EULA very carefully. So that we kind of really want you to do. And the second one, we really want you to just, run whatever you are seeing getting out of Gen AI tools through the filter of the three, bullet items. So first of all, you look at something that GenAI gave you, and you're like, well, the output is not even copyrightable. Because again, it could be that it was completely generated by GenAI, or it could be, it wouldn't even be copyrightable if produced by a human, because it is so trivial, and trivial matters are not copyrightable. So if that is the case, then just go ahead, use it. I like to call it autocomplete clause. So we had no problem with you using autocomplete because it would generate typical, trivial boilerplate. And boilerplate, well, if you believe, Google versus Oracle, boilerplate is not even copyrightable, but at least we can all agree that it's trivial enough. So item number 2 is no third-party materials are included in the output. Now that is much more tricky to assess because again, you kind of either have to trust the vendor and read their EULA and say like, well, we stand behind the fact that it's, no third-party materials are included in the output, or you could run your own tools like, Palamida or Black Duck and sort of, verify that. Or any third-party materials that are included are being used with permission, right? So obviously item number 2 and item number 3 puts additional work on developers. And we kind of really don't have any ways of enforcing it. But this is here more to just guide how you would think through accepting some of the outputs of these, Gen AI tools. Because even before, again, like if you're copying and pasting codes from Stack Overflow, you kind of have to think about the same set of constraints as well. So that's basically what it boils down to. There's a lot of other details. I really encourage you to go and read it. And interestingly enough, the feedback that I heard after we published it, which happened, almost 2 years ago, has been that even the corporations nowadays look at it and tend to adopt the definitions and the principles that we outlined in that document. So it's spreading, not as quickly as I would like, but I think you will see it in way more places than just the Apache. Finally, one last bit that I wanted to leave you with is in the open source software community, attribution has always been everything, right? We're really kind of like our karma, if you will, in this community depends on attributing the work of others. And the way I look at Gen AI is exactly the same these days. Like it's a helpful assistant that needs to be attributed. And if you start just kind of like thinking of it as a junior developer, helpful assistant, whatever you want to call it, a lot of other things kind of become what you would do anyway. So you don't have to special case it, right? So this is a good example of a pull request that nowadays would come from a piece of code generated by Claude Code, right? So there's a GitHub user, who is a cat. And honestly, I wouldn't even know. Maybe the cat itself is AI. Like I wouldn't know, right? Like pull requests come, and it's not like I actually have a police force that would allow me to really uncover the identity of, this lovely cat. But, assuming that that cat is, somewhat human, that cat is obviously producing this piece of code, and I can actually see it because that is attributed, right? You could actually see Claude being a co-author because there is a way in Git to sort of have somebody who co-authored the code, write in the metadata of a commit. So I can actually see that, some of these commits and this pull request, came purely from a human being. Some of them came from a human being collaborating with Claude Code. And that just helped me orient myself as a maintainer of this project. I can basically reason about what's going on here. So just a simple act of attributing AI becomes very useful. Now, again, all the kudos go to Claude Code because by default, actually, if you ask Claude Code to create commits for you, it would self-attribute. But even if you're creating commits based on the work that Claude Code does, just please attribute it the same way that it self-attributes. And then the rest of the open source supply chain will thank you many, many times later. So that's kind of it. That's in the practical terms, what I see as a maintainer of an open source project. That's how I reason about it. And that's sort of the guidance that I give everybody else. Now, a few parting thoughts before I conclude. So, like I said, any policies that open source software projects or even businesses adopt will need to be reviewed and updated regularly. Nothing has been settled. Like if you forget anything and everything after this presentation, remember this one thing. We are not dealing with a settled law. we basically need to kind of read up on it every single day because cases are being settled, and that URL that I gave you with the case tracker is really super useful for that. This is a rapidly evolving area. So again, whatever open source software projects decide today, we will have to reevaluate our policies, and we do at the Apache Software Foundation. So again, you can kind of subscribe to our legal discussion mailing list, and if we ever update our policy, you will get that discussion there. And we're obviously tracking changes in the law, changes in the AI technology and related tools itself, because again, maybe half a year from now, we're looking at AGI, and then this whole idea of copyright will be completely up in the air. Like, who knows? But also, we're looking at changes in tolerance for risk and ambiguity among adopters of ISS. Because one last parting thought that I would like to leave you with is, in the open source community, we're kind of used to the fact that open source is now considered safe, right? But it wasn't the case even 15, 20 years ago. 15, 20 years ago, actually, thanks to back then Microsoft mostly, there was a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt about using open source in your commercial products. And it took us 15, 20 years to actually get over that fear. It would be really sad if somehow us, collective open source community, would lose that battle in the age of Gen AI. And all of a sudden, open source will yet another become this, well, should we really use it? Is it too risky type of a conversation? I really don't think we can survive that type of risk. So again, to me, as a VP of Legal Affairs at the Apache Software Foundation, as I mentioned, I don't really worry that much. I worry somewhat, but not that much about ASF getting sued over any of this. But I really do worry a lot about ASF creating a supply chain that is safe to use and therefore staying relevant, 10 years from now. So that's it. That's pretty much all I wanted to talk about. Took me a little bit over time, but hopefully it was useful. So any questions, any comments, I would love to answer them.
Thank you, Roman. That was great. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat and we can ask them there. I will start off. You did show the pull request and the documentation that's occurring there. Is that evolved as a sort of standard approach to an attribution model? Are there other practices that foundations are doing or implementing? Are you seeing the documentation as part of the CLA in any way? I don't know, just that. And then also, are there other best practices maybe for how developers are engaging with the AI, or maybe not best practices, but not really bad practices that you shouldn't do? So it's sort of two questions there.
So I'll start with, just sharing a bunch of my personal observations. So observation number one is that in the, at least Apache Software Foundation and kind of like adjacent communities, I see a lot of clarity now. And it's almost like everybody in the open source community, at least that I see, has bifurcated into one of the two camps. Camp number one is, I call them like, well, Gen AI is nothing but autocomplete on steroids, right? And this is how I'm going to use it. And if that is in fact the way that you're prompting it, the way that you're approaching it, you don't really have to worry about much, right? Because at the end of the day, you're literally just using it to automate like super boring parts of your job that would not have been copyrightable anyway. Now, again, there's still a little bit of a gray area there, but by and large, that statement stays. But I would say, and again, that now is a completely personal opinion, I would say that that approach to Gen AI is super limiting. In effect, you're having this, wonderful tool. And again, in the interest of full disclosure, I, as an open source developer, use Gen AI a lot these days, right? You have this amazing tool, and you're really limiting its applicability to just like being, autocomplete on steroids. That just doesn't do it justice, right? That's like sort of not even using 10% of it. So that's the second camp of developers that I see in the open source that are basically just going wild with things like Claude Code. These are the people who basically have multi-agent systems set up in their TMUX environments, right? It's kind of like cool because, all of a sudden you have this like old school Unix feeling, but like you're not talking to your junior developers, you're talking to actually AI agents, trying to ask them to complete, a certain set of tasks, and it's all happening in front of your eyes. And it's actually like, it's a very different experience. So that second camp of developers obviously has to worry a lot about the type of attribution that I was showing on the on one of the slides at the end. And there, we at Apache Software Foundation put out the guidance, again, almost 2 years ago, saying that, like, well, you have to attribute. That is actually helpful to all of us. And a lot of developers started doing it, which is nice. But a lot of the Gen AI vendors, again, like Claude Code, for example, started doing it by default. So again, if you just ask Claude Code to create a commit for you, which a lot of people do because it's kind of like this mindless, work that you'd rather have a AI agent do for you, it actually self-attributes. So I think, the notion that attribution is what will help us guide us through this, changing landscape has definitely taken root.
Great thing. We have a question from Simon. Do you give much credence to the third camp that regards training on an AI on open source code as a way to strip off the license so it can be reused without compliance?
I
It's in
really
the
don't
chat
think
too.
there's any malice. Yeah, no, I think I get that question all the time. I don't think there's any malice going on in the industry. I really don't think so. I feel that all of the, let's call them frontier, model companies, frontier model companies are trying to get their hands on as much data as possible just to basically stay relevant and competitive. And to some extent, it's a symbiotic relationship for somebody like myself. Because I really want those models to have been trained on all sorts of code bases, right? Now, again, having said that, I really would love for these vendors to also start investing more in tools like Palamida and Black Duck, and kind of like have those features as part of their offering, so that then, an AI agent would generate something, but yet another AI agent would look at it and say, like, well, that sort of looks familiar. It looks similar to like some of the other code bases. Because at the end of the day, I have no problem as a human being attributing something that was pointed out to me. In fact, that actually happens all the time. So one of the little known facts is that in the foundations, a lot of work that I do as a VP of legal, I don't really send, cease and desist letters like, your corporate lawyers do. I send nice letters to people saying like, hey, you seem to be maybe unknowingly violating, the terms of our license. Would you please, correct your actions? And amazingly enough, 99% of the time, people are like, oh, yeah, that's totally reasonable. Like, thank you for pointing it out. So it's no different from that interaction, right? So again, don't assume malice. Assume, I guess, incompetence, even on AI part. And just help make the system better. That would be my call to action.
All right. Well, once again, I want to thank Roman for taking the time to share this with us. For folks, if they have questions, I don't know, Roman, I asked beforehand. I hope he doesn't get inundated, become the consultant for every university in the country or across the world now who's looking for this for some help. But he might be a starting point to find more resources. I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us. Keep an eye out for next month's. I believe it's Dwayne O'Brien, who many folks probably know I think he's now with Capital One. He's been running open source program offices for a while, all the way back years ago with PayPal and so on, and working with InterSource. So we'll be having a discussion with him. And with that, I'd like to say thanks again, and we'll see you next month.